Will infrastructure expenditure make the future brighter? The 2014 budget speech coverage is brought to you by Old Mutual Corporate.
Hello and welcome to the special coverage of the 2014 budget address by Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan. I'm Kukuletu Mfupi. While joining me to take a look at the reaction of the business community to the budget announcement today, in Cape Town we're joined by Hugh Hacking. He's the head of Old Mutual Corporate Consulting at Old Mutual Corporate, as well as Adam Ebrahim. He's the CEO of Oasis Asset Management. Now he'll be joining us a little bit later, but in Johannesburg at the desk with me, 2 roses and 2 thorns, or is it 4 roses? Well, we'll unpack that in just a moment. We have Christo van der Rheede. He'll be joining us a little bit later. He's the chief executive of the Afrikaanse Handelsinstituut. Matsi Modise, executive director of the South African Black Entrepreneurs Forum, as well as Raymond, Parsons, special policy advisor to Business Unity South Africa. And later we'll be joined by Christo Buertes. But let's get the overall reaction to the speech today. And I want to find out if business is encouraged by this. Raymond, let's start off with you.
Well, I asked myself after the speech, the average business person who'd been watching it or looking at some of the summaries, what view would they have? And my impression is they would have a positive view of what is quite a realistic and a balanced approach by a Minister of Finance who's been facing very difficult economic circumstances. And in particular, the craftsmanship which he's had to show in order to be able to project a plausible balancing act. But importantly, I think, to do so very strongly within the National Development Plan. So although in some ways you could unpack it and say, this is a positive holding operation before an election, there are some of these futuristic aspects that encourage us to look further ahead and say, this budget is part of the step into the future, and that future has to be shaped by the National Development Plan. And that commitment is very important. No doubt later on we'll come to the issue of, but is it shared sufficiently widely? But clearly, as far as fiscal policy is concerned, it is being increasingly in line with something which even some of the commentators find difficult to accept. The framework of the National Development Plan are going to be our marching orders in the next few years. And we've got to see how that's going to happen, bearing in mind that some of the success will lie outside the budget, outside the control of any Minister of Finance. But as far as today is concerned, I think there would be a very positive reaction that under difficult circumstances, he has crafted a very positive and good message, bearing in mind there is an election coming, so obviously there's a bit of a spin on it. I think we must accept that. But even if you remove that, there are some positives there that stand on their own merits, and I think that will encourage business.
Matsi, do you share the same sentiments?
I would like to echo what my colleague has said just now. It was generally well received. People are happy with the fact that there's a growth projection of 2.7. It's different from the 3% that was initially projected. And also, I just feel that a lot of people do feel that it's quite conservative. They're looking for something that's quite, out of this world. And, with a budget deficit being 4%, it's much better than what people have projected. At the end of the day, it is, what does this translate to the man on the street? I represent micro to small businesses in South Africa. And the man in the street that's selling tomatoes, what does the budget mean? South Africa has been notorious for having great initiatives, spending a lot of money. The budget was quite considerate. And, 6.5 billion rands towards supporting small businesses. It's a considerable amount. But now the question is that how is it going to filter to the guy on the street that's trying to build a small business? And that's perhaps the discussion we need to have today.
Great points, which we will delve into. And Christo, your insights?
Yes, I can echo what the others have said already. And I appreciate the fact that more emphasis is also placed on infrastructure spending, which is very positive. Then also to curb government expenditure, their consumption expenditure, to reduce red tape. And there's a lot of positive things happening, and also what they've addressed with regards to small businesses, industrial development, and incentives for that. I appreciate that.
I think one must reinforce the point that quite an important part of the speech today was devoted to the recommendations of the Davis Committee on Tax, which did focus in its interim report on how can we help small business, small and emerging business. And I think that's important, the whole question of entrepreneurship, small business being seen by the National Development Programme to having to create the bulk of the jobs we're looking for. That has been taken on board fiscally. That's very important. That in no way at all detracts from the fact that I sense from one of my colleagues, she's been here before and she's saying, well, we must make it happen. And I think that is the crucial challenge.
I'm happy that you raised that, but I have a certain feeling that when it comes to small businesses, he makes mention of it in his speech, but there's not enough clarity. But Hugh, I want to get your insights on this from Cape Town. You represent the corporate perspective of things. In a nutshell, your view of the Finance Minister's speech today.
Gugu, I think that today's speech was a really good speech. I think that it wasn't a bells and whistles speech. I think some people may say it wasn't that exciting, but I think it addressed some really important issues. One of those is fiscal stability for our country. I think that was very well addressed. One will note that nominal expenditure for the fiscus has remained unchanged. That's despite projected higher inflation rate, which actually means that in real terms, expenditure will be controlled downwards. And that's a very positive message. I think that's something that we need at this point in time to manage the outlook of our deficit. I think the other thing that's really important as well is that the budget really is cognizant of rating agency type views of our economy, and that of course will prevent portfolio outflows into the future. It'll prevent our bonds being re-rated, and that I think also is something that's really positive in there. I think also that the budget has made reference to undertakings made in the past around critical social infrastructure spending. Retirement reform is one of those. The National Health Bill that's being looked at and piloted currently. And I think that those are important undertakings and that they maintain a level of stability in what we're doing. Coupled, of course, with a continuing commitment to capital expenditure. It's very easy for governments to slash capital expenditure in times of difficult economic growth, but we haven't seen that happening here.
I want us to unpack this a little bit further, and perhaps we can zone into what the Minister said about government support for business in his budget overview. And here's a short snippet of what he said.
Increased support and tax relief for entrepreneurs and small businesses is proposed. Incentives for industry are strengthened, including funding for special economic zones. Nearly 500,000 subsistence and smallholder farmers will receive training and financial support from the budget.
Training and financial support. Now, I'm surprised by these sentiments. Are we seeing these flow through, Christo, into being translated into action for businesses at the moment?
Yeah, I think there's definite allocations in the budget. If I look at the budget review, the documents, there's monies made available to the IDC for CFA, for even the jobs fund for creation of jobs, and that's going to happen through SMEs, small and medium enterprises. If you also look at the infrastructure development together with their job creation in the rural parts, also with small-scale farming. It's very positive, and I think it's happening. Also, the training that they want to do for small-scale farmers. So it's not just a matter of, here's the money and you must go on your own. You actually get assistance through training and proper training programs.
You see, one of the important points here is that there's often an attitude that after you've read the budget speech and the different sectors in the economy have been addressed in the speech, some of them sit back and say, show me, show me. My message to business is there are a number of positive interventions here which you must now engage business and say, we want to make this happen. Don't sit back and wait for a bureaucrat to call you. Say you have announced something in the budget. I am engaging you, whether it's in the field of agriculture or whichever industry it is. Certain things have been announced. We wish to engage with you to make it happen.
I want us to zone into the different segments, Raymond.
Than just taking a supine attitude, well, nothing has happened. It was announced in the budget. What did you do to engage the relevant government department to say, that was announced in the budget, we must make it happen?
I want us to zone in, and particularly let's start off with Matsi with small to medium enterprises. Sure. This is a field that you deal with, entrepreneurs as well. Is government making it easy for entrepreneurs to start their businesses? And as Raymond says, are you engaging government on that?
Well, the thing is, Gugu, a lot of money has been deployed, clearly, but the administration of that money is a concern. You know, over the past 5 years, about 100 billion rands has been spent on supporting small businesses, whether it's in funding of small businesses, but till this day, we are still stuck with a rate of 25% of unemployed people, and 70% of those are youth. So clearly, there's a bit of a mismatch between what's been deployed to how it's been administered. And to answer your question on, do I feel that the government is reaching down or engaging with organizations like the South African Black Entrepreneurs Forum? I find it as a challenge, I must be honest. I think there's various layers it's normally a top-down approach, never a bottom-up. We never know what do small businesses on the ground actually require. So those are the elements of engagements that the government now, as much as it's deployed a lot of funding towards these initiatives and support, it sounds wonderful, but when is it going to translate into the numbers of, by us doing, being able to spend so much on developing small businesses, what has it resulted into? We still have 25% unemployment.
And that's the question. It always goes back to small to medium enterprises. But large corporates also take a blow for it. The likes of Alexander Forbes. We're joined in Cape Town by Andrew, or rather Edward Kieswetter. He's the chief executive of Alexander Forbes. Andrew, is this, or Edward, is this a similar trend that you're seeing? Matsi mentions that government is making the funding available, but not enough interaction taking place. You, as the head of a large corporate structure in South Africa, is this a problem that you're also experiencing?
Let me just first of all say that I agree with the commentary that a no-surprise budget is in fact exactly what we need. And when you look at the messaging in the budget, it's quite important for a number of reasons. The fiscal framework, the fact that government is determined not to let expenditure run away, not to give its clarity around its deficit, both the capital account as well as the budget deficit trending down. I think those are important messages. The challenge always comes with the implementation of some of these policy and regulatory instruments. And yes, I think there a lot of work still has to happen in terms of ensuring that those frameworks and those provisions that are either given through the tax or through other measures actually filter down and impact on the actual programs. And I think there we still can step up and improve the level of the dialogue, but also the level of specificity with which some of these measures are implemented.
What were you like, or maybe I should come to you for this, Raymond? You seem very eager. What more specific focus should we be placing on the interactions between government as well as business?
I think if we can go back to what I said about the National Development Plan, which hasn't been fully absorbed either by the public or the private sector. One of its messages is precisely this, that the average citizen, but now we're talking more particularly about small business, must take an attitude that they're volunteers, not supplicants. They must seize the opportunities that are there. And it requires both a top-down and a bottom-up interaction. What we've seen over a few years is too much of top-down. Money is made available. I mean, take the field of education as one example. I mean, we're among the world's leaders in the amount of money we devote to education. But what are we getting for it? Now, that's where the wheel hits the tarmac. Once again, in this budget, we've seen some constructive interventions, but they've got to be translated into action, and you can't put the entire responsibility on government. Those interest groups that stand to gain by it must stop behaving as supplicants and become volunteers. Step forward and say, you have announced this, I will help you to make it happen.
Maybe the question then is, do people know this? Because so often
well, there is a communication issue. I mean, the budget speech has come and gone. By tomorrow we talk about something else. But what is in there is concrete. That means others, the interest groups, must take the ball and run with it and score a goal at the bureaucrat's door and say, that's been done, I want it. And if they don't get it, they must kick up a fuss. They must kick up a fuss. But they mustn't behave like supplicants. They must say, I want to help make this happen. And in that sense, it would be very much in the spirit of the National Development Plan, which says we really want to limit the attitude of dependent. I sit back, the government has to come to my door and do something. Well, in some cases, in the case of welfare and so forth, that's necessary. But when you're talking about entrepreneurship, the very concept of entrepreneurship suggests you're going to go out there and you're going to maximize that gain. And if there's some assistance available, you're going to ensure that it serves its purpose, that it will do the things it has to do. And unless that's there is that collaborative attitude between, in this case, small business and the government departments, and we rattle each other's cages and make it happen. That's the only way. Otherwise, we'll go from budget speech like Tarzan, swinging from one set of excuses to another. So I really think that this is a great watershed year. And if we can look at the next few years through the spectacles of a new plan, which mobilizes us to take different attitudes, we will turn a lot more of this into outcomes than we've been able to do so far.
Matsi, I think you found yourself a new spokesperson to
Absolutely.
speak to your group of entrepreneurs about taking action. Well, when we come back from the break, we will unpack businesses' reaction to the Finance Minister's budget speech when we return. Well, joining me now to take a look at the panel's reaction at the budget announcement today, we're joined by Gerhard Papenfus. He is the Chief Executive of the National Employers Association of South Africa. Gerhard, welcome. Hopefully you'll also get into the arm wrestling taking place there. We've got coordination on this side. Well, you're all wearing purple or mauve, so I'm not sure if Christo, that means that we're on the outside of this club, hey? Maybe we're not in this.
Wearing purple?
We talked to each other before this.
Quite clearly.
It's a club tie.
How much do we have to pay?
Membership.
Yeah, we'll get there. But earlier on, before the break, we were touching on small to medium enterprises, and we heard Raymond's sentiments that entrepreneurs themselves also need to hold government accountable. But I want us to zone in into infrastructure. This has been on the table for many years now. Recently, we saw corporate companies publishing their numbers, and the projects are on the order books, but nothing is really coming through to fruition. What's your take on this? Is this being how are you interpreting this from a business and an employer's perspective?
Well, you know, I was thinking of starting off on a different note, but since we're talking about infrastructure,
I just decided to throw you under the bus because it's not your area of expertise.
Well, all I know, it's very hard for particularly small business, because they're the guys that's doing business in the Eastern Cape and in East London and in Bloemfontein and in the Northern Cape, and all I know is that infrastructure is definitely not up to standard, and it's very hard for these guys to grow their businesses there. It is very expensive to do business in those areas, and you know, I've heard Minister Gordon says that you know, that's very high on their priority list, and one can only welcome that. But the fact he said it, and let's see it now whether it's going to happen now.
Well, let's hope so. But just to get some perspective from our colleagues in Cape Town, where I understand the temperatures are fairly high today, your view on the infrastructure investment arena in South Africa, are the projects just taking too long to come on board, or are the construction companies the ones falling behind by not taking advantage of the projects?
Gugu, I'm not an infrastructure building specialist, so I won't hesitate. I won't try to answer on who is taking too long or not too long. What I can say is that infrastructure development is the backbone of economic growth. So it's really welcoming to see that there's specific mention of specific initiatives in the budget speech, and that there's a real commitment to this. I think that infrastructure development, you know, one can talk about, is it too slow, is it too fast? I think the main thing is that the speech currently provides a solid commitment to continue spending on infrastructure. And I think that's through difficult times, difficult economic growth, slowing growth. But ultimately, I think what the minister has recognized is that if you put in place infrastructure today, you will ultimately reap the rewards tomorrow, because you really have to invest ahead of the curve with infrastructure. These projects take longer. Large infrastructure initiatives take 5-10 years sometimes to actually develop.
Can I just add to that?
Sure, you can,
because I think this was one of the important messages in the budget today. In the past, we've tended to sacrifice the infrastructure for consumption spending. It was too large a feature in the budget. He made a point today of saying, look, we're shifting the emphasis. You can see it in the numbers. We're going to invest more in the infrastructure. That's absolutely right for growth, jobs, and for your global competitiveness. We've lagged behind. We've now got to catch up. But just a note of warning. this number of 847 billion rand has been around for 2 or 3 years. I'm saying, where are the projects? Why are we still having problems with Eskom, for example, where a large part of the money is going? So quite clearly, how, once again, to translate the money into outcome is the challenge, because that money is already budgeted. It's not a future financing problem.
Doesn't this bring to mind then issues with regulation in keeping government accountable to the spend, Christo?
Well, it's very important, but I think it's also, fortunately, the government has created a structure called the Presidential Infrastructure Coordinating Committee. That's very important. And there's legislation in Parliament to give Minister Patel the opportunity to push the infrastructure along. But you won't be able to do that with the government alone. It's clear that you will have to involve the private sector on a much bigger scale. So that's part of the challenge. If we want to ensure that our growth rate will rise in the years ahead, that we will be globally competitive, which is very important for wanting to create jobs. We want to carve out a bigger share of world investment, carve out a bigger share of world trade. But we must get the goods out of the ports. We must be able to move the goods to the markets. And that's why this emphasis in the budget today, admittedly, it's still the same amount of money, but the fact is that you are now shifting the emphasis and you're putting your back to the behind the implementation of the infrastructural spending is a very positive move. And once again, collectively, the private sector must rally behind that. Don't let it dissipate. Although there may be an election,
private sector on this,
because these projects have to be done. We want to keep the lights on, for example.
Well, definitely. We want to keep them on for longer.
Yeah, but I think there's a few things that's also happening, that the orders is there and there is delivery taking place. So if I just look at Eskom, there's quite a few private electricity generators that's now coming on board, like the wind farms and the solar panels that's been put up in the Northern Cape. That's coming on board. It's a big plus to the grid. Then you look at the rolling stock of Transnet. It is definitely, it's happening. The upgrade of the stations is happening. The coal terminal in Richards Bay, it happened, and there's further plans to further develop it. If you look at the iron ore line, it is being upgraded. The manganese one. So there's definite things happening, but
the progress is slow.
It is too slow, and then also some of the implementers is not playing their part. Like, for instance, they had to reallocate some of this past year's budget of Limpopo to other provinces because they haven't fixed their roads. They haven't contracted the people. So it is a matter of just juggling and giving the people accountability.
But I think, just to add one important point.
I have to go to Cape Town now. My director is going to kill me.
The issue of energy is very important.
The issue of energy is very important. Well, let's speak to a representative of the private sector, and keeping with Edward, who is the chief executive of Alexander Forbes. Edward, from your perspective, or rather, excuse me, let's rather go to Adam, a perfect company to cross to, because Adam Ebrahim, he's the chief executive of Oasis Asset Management. You're an investment firm. When it comes to these infrastructure projects, are you willing to put money on it, or rather, maybe not, but participate in the infrastructure development programs in the country?
There are three things. Firstly, the government is spending significantly on infrastructure, and the issue really is the private sector is not spending as much on infrastructure, and that is a big problem. Secondly, the private sector construction and engineering firms are not delivering to the extent that they should deliver. They're underperforming very materially. So the big construction and engineering firms, that's our bottleneck, not government. And the problem is we need to get the private sector to stop talking about government and get on with the act of delivering on their mandate to create profitability and create employment and to create growth in South Africa. So the issues are that we have the rolling stock, we've got the capacity at the ports, but we cannot deliver the product, not because there's no rolling stock, there's no transport. Transnet are doing their job, but the mines and the manufacturing companies are not doing theirs. So as shareholders, we really need to put pressure on companies to improve their performance And secondly, once companies improve their performance, we're very happy to follow rights issues, bond issues, and specific infrastructure issues. So in South Africa, it's not a case of a lack of opportunities, it's a case of the private sector rather than the public sector not delivering.
Many people would argue that the private sector is not performing because of the labor issues and the strife that they're facing. Are those possible excuses?
I think a lot of the issues at the labor front in the workplace, again, has to go back to the private sector. We haven't taken responsibility for our workforce to ensure they have appropriate living standards, appropriate cash to go home with. And so over the last 10, 15 years, we've introduced micro-lending, we've introduced credit retailers, we've credit insurance, we've introduced funeral insurance. All of this has been taken off people's monthly pay. We should take all of that out of the system and get a more streamlined way of providing funeral benefits. People don't need credit life. In South Africa, credit life is most probably 10 to 20 times overpriced. So you could actually buy the big life companies, and the big insurance companies are actually creating an environment where they're overcharging, they're mis-selling, and there's a concept called treating your client fairly. And if that is properly introduced in South Africa, you'll find that the workplace will start improving. We must produce homes and water and services to our people where we have mines. That will ensure the workplace is actually an effective place. It's not only about wages, and it's not only about blaming the workers for going on strike. People need a good quality of life and a good workplace to live in, and an effective, productive capacity. Then they'll work. Nobody wants to be away from work. So we actually put pressure through our corporate actions to ensure that companies provide housing where they need to, where they take these garnishee orders out of the system. So we are a very proactive manager and investor. We believe in the long-term future of South Africa, and the long-term future of South Africa is not to criticize, but to get into action and get business, government, and labor to work for the long-term future of this beautiful, impeccable, fantastic country we live in.
Adam, you have a very nice optimistic view about our future in South Africa. But just to get quick comments from the desk, Matsi, you had something to say regarding
Yes, indeed.
labor.
I say let's take public infrastructure investment to a different level. Township economies need to be revitalized. Now, a lot of money has to be spent on that. And how much of the big pie is it going to go into our township economies? Technological infrastructure has to be spent on, business incubators. How do we revitalize these township economies? So a lot of that money needs to be apportioned to, revitalizing our township economies. So it's a very, very, something that the minister didn't touch into the detail of how it's going to be spent, but as somebody who's a representative of, micro to small businesses in townships and underserved communities, I say that let us focus on revitalizing our township economies, because that's where most of our small and underserved small businesses come from. Yeah.
So key focus there on supporting the small man on the street. But Gerhard, you represent a lot of employees in South Africa who also face labor issues in the country, aside from the entrepreneurs. Is that a huge challenge that maybe was not addressed appropriately in the budget speech?
The challenge of that business is facing with regard to the labor environment. Is that the question?
Yeah.
Yeah, huge. And I disagree. While he was Mr. Ebrahim was talking, I was thinking, in the good old days we blame government. He says we can't. we must, but government must take blame for environment that they've created, in which business need to operate. And especially small business. Large business perhaps have the same thing. But I tell you that we want business to perform while we bind their hands behind their backs. It is an extremely over-regulated environment. The unions and the labor laws is extremely powerful, and yes, it is an extremely difficult environment to perform in. And even there's a lot of rules and legislation coming up that will make it even more difficult. And business indeed find it very hard to produce to the extent that they want to.
Back to our business panel, which is unpacking the Finance Minister's budget speech today. Well, we are joined now at the desk by yet another Christo, but this time it's Christo van der Rheede, Chief Executive of the Afrikaanse Handelsinstituut, together with Matsi Modise, Executive Director of the South African Black Entrepreneurs Forum, Raymond, Special Policy Advisor to Business Unity South Africa, as well as Christo Boertes. He is with Business Partners. Are you impressed with my Afrikaans, Christo?
Brilliant.
I tried, just a little bit. But one thing that doesn't need any translation in any language is tax. And yet again, that brought up, but it does seem as though the Finance Minister managing to allay fears when it comes to corporate tax increases.
What we need to understand is that the Minister has a political mission, and that is to satisfy his political constituency. And remember, this is an election year, so he's tried his utmost best to sort of satisfy his constituency, taking care of the social issues within the budget, and he's done remarkably well, and I've got a few issues with that which I'll discuss later on. But on the other hand, he's also quite aware of the economic reality, and it's quite harsh out there. And I think he has tried his utmost best also to sort of take care of business and also address the issue of tax. And he has mentioned the issues that the Davis Committee has been looking at. So all in all, I think it was a fine balancing act, but he could have done could have walked the extra mile for business, because it is business at the end of the day that drives the economy of this country.
You say he must walk the extra mile. What do you want him to do specifically? I
think he could have lifted the 5 billion, which was now sort of allocated for small business. Could have made that perhaps a little bit more, and much more. Also in terms of the incentives, I think looking at that, and then also the promises in terms of the regulatory framework he's going to do. I mean, it will be quite interesting to see how he is going to address that, because within that is the labor issue. If we do not address the labor issue, then we will not really get very far in terms of the promises he has made to make it easier for business.
And yeah, I was thinking business would be happy they didn't increase corporate tax, huh?
Well, I think
I'm asking for too much here.
Well, no, I think perhaps one must be realistic given the circumstances that he faced. But firstly, let me make 2 points. The first is we must be very clear in analysing the budget. There are decisions that lie outside the realm of the National Treasury. The trouble is they can undermine whatever good intentions the National Treasury may have. And it's up to business partly to ensure that they address those issues where it is appropriate. But coming to the tax issue, if you take a snapshot picture, then I think we all agree, as I said right at the outset, that he's done a good job to balance his budget within difficult circumstances. But if you take a dynamic view, which is why the Davis Committee has been appointed, which shows a degree of prescience on his part, it's a snapshot picture of a limited tax base, which unless you get growth in employment, your back is going to be increasing to the wall next year and the year after and the year after. So quite clearly, the dynamic element is the Davis Committee. It's looking at the tax base, it's looking at the balance between direct and indirect taxes. What should we do about VAT? In any other country, you would put up VAT, because you actually do want to discourage consumption to some extent in the long term, and you want to encourage saving. So quite clearly, there's a limited tax base within which you've been able to operate at the moment, bring the borrowing down so that, and I think just to come back to an earlier point, from a business point of view, you actually want the reassurance that the public finances are under control. It is a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition for the other things that have to be done down the passage. But you need to know that the government checkbook is under control. That's a point of departure. And I think he's put that message over. But more importantly, looking down the road, why is growth important? Yes, we want it because we want to get unemployment down, we want to get poverty down, we want to get inequality down. But another reason is we want to have a reasonable tax ratio, a reasonable tax burden.
Is a reasonable tax ratio in line with international standards, like with VAT?
Ours is creeping up. Each time it creeps up a little. Of course, to some extent, it is arithmetic. If the growth rate drops, the other ratios rise. So one mustn't have a nightmare about it. But underlying it, one of our structural problems is the limited tax base. And if you don't get that right by growing the economy, bringing more people into employment so that they pay taxes, the rest is just really tinkering. And that is the big challenge that the Davis Committee is facing. How do you align the tax system with our growth aspirations within the National Development Plan?
Raymond, I hope you can keep it there, and maybe one of our colleagues in Cape Town can answer that for us. Edward Kieswetter with Alexander Forbes. Is there a way of broadening the tax base? You have a tax unit within your company. How do you do this without attacking the small guy on the street?
I think the Minister has demonstrated consistently, along with Treasury over the last decade, that they've resisted the easy instrument to increase tax rates. On the contrary, we have seen corporate tax rates come down. We've seen the marginal tax rates on individuals come down. We've seen a steady hand on VAT. Now, you might argue that all of that comes down to slow, but what we have to concede is that the Minister has been very mindful not to increase the tax burden on individuals or companies by doing the quick thing, which is to increase rates. The second thing, I think, is VAT remains a very regressive tax. We live in an unequal society, and often increasing the VAT rate harms the very people you seek to protect. I think when we speak about taxes, it's also important to note that in a young democracy like South Africa, the tax system does have to have a redistributive nature or character. And we've seen that consistently this year. The 9.3 billion of rebates is slanted towards giving relief to employees who earn below 250 million. In that, 40% of that relief goes to that. So it is about finely balancing this. It's about avoiding the obvious. And I think the Minister has done well to not take the easy way out, to contain government expenditure, to be clear about the fiscal framework, and therefore the level of debt we will incur, and to continue to drive by broadening the tax base. The two specific things was locally to ensure high levels of compliance by looking at anti-avoidance measures, and secondly by broadening the tax base by including the worldwide income of individuals. And I think by doing that over the last 10 years, and we forget, the Treasury and the Minister have been able to give back more than 100 billion of relief to taxpayers.
Well, we will continue unpacking this discussion after this short ad break, where we get more reaction from the business sector's response to the budget speech delivered by Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan. Don't go away. Joined by our guests, Edward Kieswetter as well as Adam Ebrahim in Cape Town, and here in Johannesburg with Christo van der Rheede, Christo Boertes, Matsi Modise and Raymond Parsons. Christo, I'd actually like to start off with you, Christo Boertes, that is, just with regard to the industrial policy that was announced today, probably a good thing for the business community.
Yes, it's very positive, and one would like to see it being properly unpacked, and there's very little detail about that. But just if you look at the incentives that DTI is providing for manufacturers, and also what SARS is allowing for, accelerated depreciation, etc. So there's encouragement to actually put money into plant infrastructure, into the private sector, into manufacturing concerns, and then also for export development. There's incentives for exports. So it's again back to what Raymond said. We must knock on the doors. We must go and make use of these incentives. And there's so many others that they've mentioned. The special economic zones. And if the people can just see what is available, and because you need something to get this economy into gear or into a higher gear, because we can't do small business and job creation without the drivers of the economy being active. And I think that is what DTI is trying to do.
I'd like us to go to Cape Town very quickly before coming back to the desk. Adam, you with Oasis Asset Management. Do you share Christo's sentiments that big business really needs to get itself in order and take advantage of the opportunities presented?
Sure. I think firstly, if you look at two things, with the rand more than 10 rand to the dollar, most South African businesses should be very, very competitive ignoring all these incentives. So if we don't have plans, and we haven't had plans for a competitive company and currency, then I don't think we're going to be ready to take advantage of all of these incentives. So I think companies need to be a bit more aggressive in being export focused, being globally focused, and we'll talk about Africa in a minute. Secondly, South Africa needs to ensure that it ensures that imports coming into the country has the right tariffs, has the right protection. There's so much money coming, goods coming into the country that is absolutely coming tax-free, VAT-free, and that's hurting our local economy. And what we need to do is we need to sort out our borders, and the Minister spoke about that today. And if we do those two things together with the economic zones, then we will have the infrastructure and the environment to get our growth rate up to the 5% that we need. If you then talk about Africa, the Minister has put in a lot of incentives to continue investing in Africa, the HoldCo. And what we really need to do is, as South Africans, the Minister indicated that I think it's 29% or 23% of our exports are now going to Africa. 12% of our dividends are coming from Africa. South Africa should be the service and export hub of Africa. We should be the connector of Africa to the world, and we as South Africans should become more Africa focused, and that will increase not only our growth rate but the growth rate of the African continent, which is expected to grow by 6% per annum. And if we can tag along with that growth rate, our economy, we have a competitive advantage relative to everybody else in the world to take advantage and deliver that growth for the African people, 6% growth, and make sure that we have employment, stability, and reduce poverty, and that will be a great place for us to live.
Adam, you mentioned some key highlights there, and the word that you mentioned quite often was incentives. Christo, at the top of the show, Christo van der Rheede, you said that you were hoping to see more incentives. How many more incentives does business need before we can actually get the wheels turning?
You know what, the devil is always in the detail. If you look at, for example, the youth incentive scheme that has been announced recently, you'll find that there are certain shortfalls in that. For example, a young person that scheme is only applicable to people who will earn a salary of 6,000 Rand on the one hand, and I think on the other hand 2,000 Rand. But understand, business is in need of highly skilled young people. And how many highly skilled young people will be prepared to work for 6,000 or 2,000 Rand? So I think that needs to be addressed. And then there are also issues within the Company Act that also needs to, that is still undermining the process that is important for you sort of to establish a business. So those are little things that are undermining business. And you know what, it's no use you talk to me or to the learned people. We need to ask the questions to ordinary business people out in the street. There where they have to face these regulations and the red tape and things like that. They bear the brunt of all of these things that they, at the end of the day, that undermine them.
Well, we are running out of time, but I just want to get closing comments from Cape Town from Edward from Alexander Forbes. Edward, your view of the budget speech today in a nutshell, and what business should be taking out of it?
I think, first of all, for me, the budget gets the thumbs up. And the reason for that is, again, the Minister goes at great lengths to demonstrate that a budget isn't a one-year event. And there's a transformation journey at play, and directionally and consistently, the same messaging has come through under the last 5 years. And that's quite important. That creates certainty. And today, further certainty was lent to the tight fiscal framework, not an open-ended spending attitude, and then also not ensuring that the taxpayers are easily have to take the burden of increased rates, either through personal, corporate, or VAT. I think what's also important is that the budget is, again, highlighting the National Development Plan as its anchor. And I think from a business perspective, where we all have to step up to the plate is to be clearer and more specific about the plans. How do we make this investment? How do we create jobs so that we do have an inclusive growth approach and not just drive growth whilst destroying work and whilst destroying the fibre of our society, because then we go for short-term goals whilst actually sacrificing our own long-term futures. For me, the budget gets a thumbs up. In terms of how fast we go, I think we'll always want more, but we have to deal with the realities of a recessive global environment and our own historical imbalances that have to be addressed.
Edward saying that the budget speech gets a thumbs up. 30 seconds, Raymond, for each of you.
Okay,
thumbs up?
Very quickly, I want us to become a nation of pragmatists. We must borrow from a Chinese leader who asked the secret of their success, their great economic success. He said it was pragmatism, and he wasn't speaking racially when he said, we didn't ask whether the cat was black or white, we just asked whether it would catch the mice. And if we follow that message of pragmatism and implementation and not ideology, we will make a lot more progress in the next few years, and that is the basic message of the National Development Plan.
Matsi, are you looking to catch any mice soon?
All the time. But my closing sentiments is that 6.5 billion investments in small businesses, and it needs to be clear how is that going to be spent. Also, it needs to translate into reduced unemployment. Let us see the return on this particular investment. Those are my remarks.
Christo, 30 seconds.
Yes, I remain positive. I think he also put the ball right into business court. You know, we must also help deliver the goods, and we must remember government cannot create sustainable jobs. They can only facilitate, and we need to do it as business people, and we need to step up to the plate, and I think they're trying to create the environment, and this budget is a good platform, and also the medium-term plans that they have, you know, the 3-year medium term.
Christo van der Rheede, thumbs up or down?
No, thumbs up. I give him an 8 out of 10. I was a previous teacher, so I always look at scoring people, you know. But very importantly for me is the minister is a visionary. But that's the problem. The big challenge is closing the gap between the visionary and the implementers. And I think our state departments and entities who are responsible for driving this budget, they need to come to the party. And business as well. Business cannot just point fingers. We need to come up with concrete and constructive and practical solutions to assist government with making sure that we are successful in this country.
So can we get a thumbs up all round?
Yes.
For the minister?
Absolutely.
I'm happy with that. Well, that's it for our special focus on what business thought of the budget address today. Do stay with CNBC Africa. Nozi Pombanja will join us after the ad break to look at the social, political aspects of the minister's budget speech. But thank you so much to all my guests, the two Christos, Matsi as well as Raymond, and in Cape Town, Edward, as well as Adam in Cape Town, who joined us for today. So from myself and the team, do stay tuned.